feeding on my tension. My countrymen, they love their fiction. The words are now, it's made with good intentions.
Welcome to 1 of 200, the independent politics and media podcast, coming to you not live from Aotearoa, where we talk about the horrible things that are happening in this country and the world. A little bit of an education special this weekend, because that's where most of the current events have fallen. We have had just an entire week of people lying about charter schools, which has been a lot of fun. We've got the Truancy Register up and running, which has been a joke. We've got the combination of those two things somehow, which is David Seymour's plans for charter schools not having to include the cell phone ban, because apparently we only care about some children's education. It's all lots of fun. I am joined by my co-hosts. Stephanie, how you doing?
Kia ora. Not doing too bad.
Great. John, how are you, John?
Pleasure to be with you.
I'm going to be getting you to carry some of the school stuff as an ex-teacher. And special guest, Andrew Dixon. How you doing?
Kia ora, I'm good, thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Yeah, I think we'll start off with charter schools straight off the bat. It's been really funny, like watching this on social media, and everyone that's like touched 1 of 200 over the last 5 years is pointing and going, we said that. We said they were going to do this. We said they were going to do this, and they're going to do it in this way, and it was going to be fucked up in these ways, and we're 100% correct. Listen to 1 of 200 if you want to be ahead of the game, everybody, because we operate the lathe of heaven, and we cannot be stopped. Our hands are bloody stumps, grinding against it. It's horrific and horrible, and then we can't do anything about it. So that's a lot of fun for everybody involved, but at least we were somewhat forewarned that this would be a fight. I wish that the Labour Party also listened to 1 of 200 and took us seriously. But John, do you want to give us a rundown, if plausible, on what's happening with charter schools in New Zealand? Because we've been here before. This is probably the most ludicrous thing about this latest charter schools attempt, is that they only failed a few years ago.
Yeah, let's just top line this. They don't work, okay? They don't work. They're a waste of money. They don't work. Like, as long as you know that, everything else from here, just understand that everything else is just like embellishing the fact that they do not work. So Labour brought all the charter schools that they could back in-house in about 2018, and that was after about 4 years of the project. I think the PPTA did an OIA, which worked out that the project wasted about $125 million, which is less than Seymour has got for this new charter schools program. Now, the thing about charter schools is that, well, this program is that Seymour has possibly learned some lessons from last time, because there was the case of the school in Whangaruru in Northland where the school failed and got shut down. And then the ministry realized that they didn't actually own the land or the buildings, and they had to negotiate to buy it back off the trust. So they gave them the money to buy the land, but they didn't actually sort it out so that if it failed, the ministry would get it back. And I think there is a state school established on that property now, but somebody walked away from that deal with millions of dollars, which is millions of dollars of education money. Now, the thing about charter schools is that the cabinet paper advice says they have minimal benefit, okay? And the expenditure that we got announced, the 153 million that got announced, is just for the cost of opening and administering the schools. So finding the land, the property, doing the admin. It doesn't include the money that the government is going to provide to pay the teachers or the money per pupil. It doesn't include that either. So this 153 million over 4 years is a large amount of money. I mean, it's more than they just took out of the mouths of hungry kids when they've changed the school program, taking the cost of secondary school feeding down from $8 to $3 per child. It's less than some of the rebuild programs, which got paused and apparently are not going to get back underway for some time. And let me just say again, it doesn't work, okay? These schools are not required to have qualified teachers. They are not required to teach the national curriculum. They are not required to follow a lot of the rules and regulations. And they also have a criminal lack of oversight, because what ends up happening is the ministry is trying to administer all of these schools which are completely outside the system and all running on their own bespoke way of doing things. And that makes it incredibly hard to track whether or not they're achieving anything at all. I mean, some of the original charter schools had massive truancy issues, which is very ironic considering what we're going to talk about a bit later. The thing that gets me about this is it failed and everyone could see it failed. And when charter schools went, nobody wanted them back, apart from a few complete head cases like that guy who runs the Villanova school in Auckland, who writes the op-eds about how great they are in the Herald all the time and goes completely unquestioned about it. Amazing guy, love him. But it doesn't work. It's an ideological project, and yet David Seymour had the fucking stones this week to criticize the PPTA for holding paid union meetings this week to talk about the charter schools. And the headline of this press release was, PPTA need to focus on learning and stop being so ideological. And his whole project is ideological. The idea of charter schools is an ideological one. As the NZEI president, Mark Potter, said this week, he goes, a lot of the things that David Seymour says he's going to solve by creating an entirely parallel system of schools could be solved by just implementing some of those changes to existing state school systems. But he doesn't want to do that because that doesn't privatize education. It doesn't remove the professional association's role in unionizing teachers. It is a purely ideological project with kids at the heart of it. However, the school system doesn't work for everyone. We know that. Kids have failed in the system. We know that. But the solution isn't to try and build a completely new system, which is going to take an awful lot of money and take it out of the system. I mean, I'm going to stop in a minute, I promise. But the UK started doing this about 2 decades ago when they started academies, which was they would take low-performing schools and turn them into academies. And now these massive academy trusts run multiple schools. And in that time, the amount of money that goes into administering those schools, of all the money that goes to schools, is about 7%. Back when it was in the state system, that was 2%. So that's 5% of money that is no longer going towards kids' education. It's going towards paying for the administration costs of all of these little bespoke networks of private schools that are funded by state money. That's a big issue because it's inefficient. And yet we're being told this is about efficiency.
Yeah, one of those really interesting things alongside this is that the plan is to set up a second office, right? Like not only a second set of schools and a set of education systems, but it's going to be reviewed and administered by a new part of the ministry. It just seems dangerous in a lot of ways. And you mentioned ideology and you talked about the unions there briefly, but in his initial press release, he was also saying, like, this is to stop the unions from being involved in education. The unions are made up by teachers, just to be really clear about that. And I don't know how people can read it any other way. And we've seen it play out like this in New Zealand and all over the world. Like, this is clearly a privatization track. And David Seymour still gets away with being treated entirely in good faith on anything he says. And then every time the media, in the first instance, publishes something that he says, maybe within a few days, it's revealed that it's just basically a lie. So you mentioned that $153 million for the project. Within 3 days, it came out that actually that was just the startup costs. It's going to cost a lot more than that. But everyone was trumpeting, it's going to cost this much. It's like, wow, how that's so cheap.
There's also another bit that I forgot about this, which is the NZEI did an OIA in January or February where they were just like, hey, how much did we spend per pupil last time we did charter schools? And it came back 6 times the amount per pupil got spent in a charter school than it would have on a state school student. So when they say, but last time charter schools got all of these improvements in education, because they do claim that, because in some schools, there were some better educational outcomes. Was it 6 times better than what we were delivering in the state? Was it 6 times better? Because if it wasn't, then it's a waste of money. And I think this time David Seymour's even said, we wouldn't be doing that because the NZEI had actually got ahead of him for once. And then the journalist went, but last time you spent 6 times per pupil. And he said, this time we'd make sure that funding was much more equal between the two systems, which I think is where it's absolutely going to fall apart. Because last time it only worked because they were pumping so much money into the system. This
and
time,
by worked, you mean stood up for 3 years?
Yeah, they stood up for 3 years, or in some cases did produce some academic changes for certain groups of young people. I'm not going to criticize a kid for getting an education, but this time, if it tracks more to the state system, it's not quite level. It's not quite a fair comparison, but it's going to be a lot fairer than it was last time, which really puts the entire ideological project there at a lot of risk. But like you said, he wants to set up a charter schools kind of ministry to go with his Ministry of Regulation. Like, when the fuck did the ACT Party start just being able to generate new ministries? Like, they're like, they've got the Ministry for Regulation, which everything now has to funnel through, and now they've got the Minister for Charter Schools. Oh yeah, and what the fuck is Dr. Liz Rata doing at the minute? Because she's on the establishment board for charter schools, right?
It's ideological picks, right? It's like pick your faves.
She's also on the National Curriculum Review. So she's reviewing the curriculum that all the povos are going to have to do at the state schools. But she's also approving schools to not have to follow the stuff that she's recommending we do for the curriculum review. There is a very limited number of people in this country who share David Seymour's completely batshit ideological views. And Don Brash is too old and racist to be put into any of these roles. So Dr. Liz's surname is going to be the one to do it. It's breathtaking. Oh, and we forgot. They said they're going to convert 35 state schools.
Yeah, this is an interesting one.
And they'll be low achieving schools for the most part. But there's not many schools that are putting their hands up. A lot of former charter schools want to go back. Bethlehem College will 100% want to go back into that system. But one of the people who has put their hand up and said, I would like to open a charter school, is His Holiness, the Bishop Brian Tamaki. Now, how popular do you think people are going to find giving Brian Tamaki lots of government money to run a school where he teaches people how to conduct bigotry and violence against marginalized communities? A sustained campaign, and thank God the PPTA and the NZEI are getting on with this. Like, I am pretty certain that Chris Abercrombie, the president of the PPTA, will fist fight David Seymour in the streets of Wellington if he gets the chance. He will fly up from Invercargill, stripped to the waist, and yell, I'm outside, bro, come on. I love Crumble. He's a great dude. But the unions are ready for this. Like, they announced it last week. This week, the PPTA had their paid union meetings. This is going to get messy. And again, it's one of these things where this is only happening because it was in the coalition agreement, not because there's any evidence that it works.
Not because there's any mandate for it, not because people voted for it.
This is another one of those ACT coalition agreement things that we're introducing. And it's like, where's the evidence? And they just say, well, there isn't. This is just because we've agreed it in the coalition.
And that's how things work.
That is apparently that's how politics
Which is just absurd.
Now.
It's probably one of the most bizarre hand waves in New Zealand politics I've ever seen, just at the scale at which they're doing it. Both New Zealand First and the ACT Party is, we put it in a coalition agreement, therefore we can just do it and there should never be any criticism of it. It's really odd. And people just let it slide.
And it's the thing that I think will actually eventually bring this down will be that Christopher Luxon reaches a breaking point where he cannot handle it being made any more obvious how terrible a leader he is and how all of his high-flying CEO bullshit is actually nonsense. Can you imagine this in a business environment? Oh, well, I signed this deal with a vendor or a supplier, so now I'm helpless. Whatever they want to do, they put it in the agreement, and I apparently said nothing, so now I am honor bound to just do whatever the heck these other companies want to do. It's nonsense. I just wanted to circle back and bring the kind of the big comms strategy brain that is my only apparent talent to this conversation and add it to what John was saying, which is, yes, these charter schools don't work. They cost a huge amount of money. They don't deliver the kind of promised benefits. And I think it's important that when we point that out, we connect it to the fact that that's not the point of them. For many policies of this government, we look at them and go, well, your stated reason for doing this is X, but it's not going to do X. And that's because their actual reason is Y. And Y is usually funnel public money into the hands of their supporters and donors. And it's important that we say that all the time, because it can get really tempting to get into the cycle of, why are they doing all this dumb stuff? It must be because they're dumb. And that allows, I think, our journalists to be left off the hook a little where they can just say, well, we just published the numbers that we were given. We assumed that those numbers were good. We assumed that Treasury had looked at those numbers when David Seymour said, I can feed kids lunch for $2. Why would we question that? Why would we call Craig Rennie and say, Craig, is this true though?
Craig, do our jobs, please.
Please, Craig.
Prime
And
Minister
in a way,
Craig Rennie.
God, we could wish. So another cynical part of my brain says that one of the other reasons they don't question these numbers the first time they hear them, is because this way they get two stories out of it. They get one headline trumpeting the slashing of public services. Oh, look, Labour must have been doing a terrible job because they were spending more than $2 on a lunch. And then they get the second story, which is, oh, wait, it turns out lunch costs more than $2. And so that's the same thing with charter schools, is they're going to get the rush of, they're going to set up charter schools because our school system is so terrible and teachers are wasting so much time teaching woke gender ideology instead of reading and writing. And then when they crash and burn, they'll go, oh, whoops, it turns out that that's not how education works. So, and adding another new ministerial body to it, again, like the obvious hypocrisy of David Seymour's stated ideology and then what he actually does directs you straight to what is the purpose, and the purpose is to impose his ideology on our education system and on our public service, and to stop public servants actually being able to offer free and frank advice. And then my final shout out was for the teacher unions, because my God, nothing pisses off the right in this country like the teacher unions. It's why they always call them the teacher unions, because as Kyle interjected, the teacher unions are just made up of teachers. Unions are their members. They are representative, Saturday morning brain, representative bodies. That's why the taxpayers union calls themselves a union, because they want to attract some of the manner of that word. But also, teachers are by far the most trusted profession in this country. When teachers stand together in their thousands and say, yeah, this policy is a bit shit, people listen. People talk to the teacher when they're dropping off their kids at school or at kindy. Teachers are in their communities. Teachers are like some of the most terrifyingly powerful voices in our communities if they stand up and use it. And when they do stand up and use it, governments tend to go, I'm so fucking sorry, please forgive me, I'll do better. And that's good. And teacher unions should do it more.
You know what? I was going to make that point. We literally look after people's kids. People trust us implicitly in what we do. And it's always interesting to see the attack on education, and they very rarely go after teachers individually, but that also happens, and what things are being taught in schools. But yeah, teachers are embedded in their community in a way which politicians would die to be. Like, we see kids, we teach kids of kids we taught, like, as we used to do. We teach generations of families, they are trusted places and people. And it's saying, oh, well, we're going to set up an entirely new school system. People just go, wait, hold on a minute. It's not teachers that are taking food out of the mouths of secondary school kids. It's not teachers who have stopped the rebuilds of classrooms, which are so badly needed. It's not teachers who are slamming the brakes on the Aotearoa Histories curriculum, which is immensely popular with students and teachers. This is all coming from the government. And I mean, I think we spoke about it back in March, Kyle, when we talked about how this government seems to be in an awful hurry to get things done without any thought that the things they are doing are not just, in some cases, nigh on impossible to actually do, but they haven't thought about how unpopular they might be. They're thinking if they do all the unpopular stuff in the first 18 months, then they can cruise on all of the success towards the next election. And it's like, that's not what's going to happen here.
Sorry, you generate consequences. You do understand this when you do. Yeah. Like, it's not just that they're unpopular, they're bad.
Yeah, they believe they can do all of their fucking around and finding out now. Unfortunately, they're spending the first half of this parliament fucking around, and they're going to spend the second half finding out. And it's, look at the fast track bill. Look at almost everything they're trying to do is running into so many brick walls that I don't think they even saw were there. Somehow the coalition agreement to this government was the equivalent of Wile E. Coyote painting a tunnel on a wall. And they said, well, we've got this tunnel and we're going to be able to go straight through this tunnel. We just have to run it as fast as we can. Meanwhile, Craig Rennie's there going meep, meep at them at every possible turn. And just, they are going to hit the wall very, very hard, very, very soon.
I really want to see it sooner rather than later.
Well, it depends on whether or not Labour go, well, actually, yeah, that is a good-looking tunnel.
Fuck.
We will review the tunnel. We haven't seen the details of the tunnel, but
Oh,
we
Stephanie, don't.
want to carefully review the tunnel. Let me exercise my trauma, Kyle.
Can I circle back to one thing that John said? So I have a kid who's Ben, who's 13, who has suffered a brain injury during his birth and suffers a lot of the kind of classifications that you would put under the signifier autism. And as a result of that, I'm a member of quite a lot of autism groups on Facebook. And one of those groups, which is a group that supports parents who have autistic kids, have talked with a lot of hope with the concept of an autism charter school. And what I'm really scared about is the kind of the hope that Seymour and the ideology is placing to try and fix those problems that John talked about that do exist in the schools that are difficult for certain types of kids. So the lack of funding over student staff ratios, lack of funding for teacher aides, for like really good qualified relief teacher support, funding for teachers more generally around neurodiversity and the issues. And the parents that were responding, and there are a lot of them, were talking about how they could try and fix those things with the concept of a charter school. And to me, that is probably the most dangerous part of this whole system, because you'll create, like, for these parents and these kids who are so vulnerable with so much need, which could be addressed with that kind of funding being put into state schools and working state schools properly. Instead, they're now looking outside at this other thing saying, well, this will fix our issues. And I'm right there with them with the hope side, but I'm also so aware that it's absolutely not going to solve any kind of problem for those kids, and I wanted to, so one thing that's really confused me about the way that the coalition government has talked about education is that Erica Stanford just seems to be half absent in talking about this kind of stuff. And I wanted to just read this. This is directly about her role as education minister. This is before the coalition government was elected. She was commenting on the third reading of a bill which was looking to try and expand birth injury coverage to ACC. And she was talking about kids. So she says, I just want to pick up very briefly on something that Michael Woodhouse, my colleague, has mentioned, and that is around injuries to babies. I also think this needs to be looked at. And the reason I think that is because when I go into schools and I talk to teacher aides, they say to me, well, this child is fully covered under ACC because of a domestic violence incident that happened when they were a baby, and the injuries they got mean they're covered by ACC. But this child over here is not covered because their injury happened at birth. And as we know, getting covered by ACC at birth can be a bit difficult, and listener, that is true. It is not always clear, as Michael Woodhouse has pointed out. And I do think, in line with what Michael has said, that this needs looking at, because I'm quoting you, Erica, here, if you ever listen, it's pretty heartbreaking when you're in a classroom and two children with exactly the same needs are being treated extremely differently. If only, Erica, you were the Minister of Education and you could somehow effect change for those children that are being treated extremely differently. Now, is it the case that we are going to say a charter school is going to take the children that are not covered by ACC and therefore have good TA funding out to put them into a different school, and we're going to give all that money to TAs and, have awesomely trained teachers focused on, dealing with hypoxic brain injury related needs through a lifespan? I mean, obviously that's not going to happen. It's absurd, stupid. I mean, don't get caught up in the ideology. Anyone listening to this, if you do have a child with additional needs, the very best thing we can do is advocate for those kids and use things like the teacher unions, so that, because the teachers want to understand, they want the support, they want the TAs in their classroom, they want the additional time, they want lower student to staff ratios, so they actually can focus on those needs. And when they do, the outcomes are amazing. So my kid has full-time TAs now. He didn't for the first several years of his education because he was not covered by ACC. He now is. And that makes a difference for not just him, but all of the other kids in that classroom. And TAs are woefully underfunded, poorly paid, and they should be paid a whole lot more because they're incredible people. But that difference to all of those kids right through that kind of system, they're now understanding the curriculum. They know what the teachers are trying to achieve. They're running interference so that kids aren't getting overwhelmed. That stuff, and how much cheaper would that be than creating a new bureaucracy, which is an odd thing for a libertarian. I mean, it just feels like very odd, right?
Again, it's not the point, right?
Yeah, right.
No, it's not. Yeah, it's not the point. Yeah, but I mean, I couldn't be more passionate about the damage that's being done to the parents of vulnerable kids by the false promise that is the concept of charter schools.
Yeah, I'm really surprised that some of those lines, some of those kind of more direct promises to kind of vulnerable minorities or whatever you want to say across the spectrum weren't made this week. And I expect to see some really bad faith stuff come out of ACT around this as it gets a bit crunchier, as there's a bit more pushback on it, like telling people that they don't care about high needs students and things like that. We're going to definitely see some really nasty stuff. What's been useful is that people were very quick to go back and find David Seymour standing with Brian Tamaki from, I think, 2018, where Seymour said this man should have had a charter school. So that's been the immediate image painted of what a charter school would be at its baseline, is a extreme religious school outside the public system, which, well done, everyone who managed to get that front and center. They'll be trying to shift that in the next couple of weeks.
I don't mean to kind of draw a parallel here, but historically New Zealand has never had a problem when it comes to siloing off high needs people into institutions which are supposedly for their benefit but end up becoming to their detriment and like generational harm. And I think it is that, as Andrew said, these kids can and should be supported within the system, but the fact is that Oars funding is a fucking joke. Like, getting support through that is a complete and utter joke, and the funding is not being increased enough. The pot is limited. If you fall outside of it, if you do not meet the highest possible needs, you're not getting that support through the system as it is. But there have been no significant efforts to make that system better. Instead, it's well, what if we just make these kids disappear from the state system? What if we put them somewhere else? And because then and the way that it's been, I mean, like Kyle said, you don't care about high need students. It's also going to be, you don't care about those other kids who are having their education disrupted by these high need students. It's these kids, these vulnerable kids, these kids with needs, these bright, wonderful children are being like treated like shit both ways. It's no, fuck off, you can't be in this classroom because you need more help than everyone else, but also you can't be in this classroom because the help you need is taking away from other kids. It's a poisonous discourse around bright, wonderful young people who deserve so much better and have been failed, not by this government, but by the last one and the one before that and the one before that. And it's not like parents like Andrew and so many around the country have very clearly said, here's what needs to happen. This is what you need to do. And the unions have pushed for it as well, but it always gets watered down when it gets to Wellington. Building a charter school system is not going to it's going to diffuse the problem between two different systems. It's not going to get rid of the fucking problem. It just, like I said, I don't teach anymore, but I have worked in classrooms with extremely high need students where the most support we could get was half a day of a teaching assistant for a student who couldn't go to the toilet by themselves or could accidentally harm themselves because they just did not have a lot of the capabilities to be able to care for themselves. So we've got a student who you would need to take to the toilet, but there would be no one to do it in the afternoon. You would have to try and send a kid to another classroom to try and find a spare teaching assistant to do that. It's horrific. It's horrific that a child with toileting issues would spend some time like sat there in their own ways because we're trying to find someone who can go and change them, and that was a reality in a school I worked in a class I taught in. And we just moved these kids to another school doesn't solve the problem. Like, you're not going to fix it this way. The state school system has to change.
Yeah.
The Ministry of Education has to change.
Yeah.
The Ministry for Disabilities has to get involved here as well. ACC has to come to the party. You can't just say, well, all of the current institutions have failed, so we'll just set up a brand new one, and I'm sure they'll figure it out. It's fine. All of these kids are still going to be under all of these different agencies. They're still going to be viewed through the state, through all these different lenses. Adding an extra lens is not going to make things clearer. It's just going to make things more blurry for them and more difficult for parents.
Both my parents were teachers. I mean, they're well retired now, but my mum taught 5 and 6 year olds for 40 years, and she went to school every day with food to feed kids that were hungry. Usually it was bread and jam and that kind of stuff. Every day of my life, I watched her do that. And we lived in I think the school's probably decile 9, I mean, it's the realities of that school system. The realities of teachers, of course, is they're extremely pragmatic people. I guess they end up having to be that way. They've got to think, how can I make this work? And because they're exceptionally busy, it's very hard to stand up and say, why am I having to make this work? Which is the question that I've always asked. The issues with wars is absolutely correct. There are so many kids who fall through every single gap because they don't meet the kind of specific criteria that ORS funding puts in kind of place. Similarly, with the school high health needs funding system, I mean, I fought them for a few years when Ben was 5 and 6, and I mean, they came to the party at the end, but it basically needed me to figure how that system worked. The thing with me is that if we actually just put a TA in, trained, well-paid, decently paid TA in every classroom, right, that would go a long way to addressing quite a lot of issues in quite a lot of kind of ways. I don't think it would solve everything for sure, and I haven't run the figures. Maybe we could ask the venerable Mr. Rennie to look at that. But the reality is that kind of system would generate employment. It would be useful in a range of kind of economic ways. It's creating TAs are linked into the community like the teachers are, so they are core kind of members of that. They understand family dynamics. They know what's happening across the community. They connect things together. Those kind of roles could be extremely useful for Whaikaha as well, the Ministry of Disabled Peoples, to understand, like, for instance, we know that kids who live in a household with a disabled person are, I might get this slightly wrong, I think they're twice as likely to live in poverty, maybe 1.5 times as likely, twice as likely if they're disabled, because it creates a whole lot of community-related issues. But all this comes back to having a good state system, like a state system that's integrated and run across and well-funded. And what we're seeing with Seymour, of course, is that he's pulling bits out of that. It's like a Jenga tower. When you pull bits out of that and you say, well, we can solve that problem over here, and we can solve this problem over here, all you're doing is exacerbating the issues in the state system for those kids who wouldn't get access, and running another system that's not going to work anyway.
I think, like, people call me cynical, you'd be surprised to hear. But two rubrics that I apply whenever a new policy comes out is, one is this more war on kids stuff. You know, we've been saying it since the beginning of the year. That's really what a lot of this seems like, especially out of ACT policy, but also out of National and New Zealand First. This is going to be detrimental to kids. They're saying one thing, but is this really war on kids? Yes. And the other one is this sufficiency, or is this giving money to their mates? Oh, yeah, look, it is giving money to their mates. And those are like the very baseline things. But obviously alongside that is this need of neoliberal parties to use austerity to push forward privatization. And basically, as soon as you apply that to any of these policies, you're like, oh, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And it's not, I would say it's not cynical. We've seen it happen in New Zealand previously, and we've seen it happen in every Western liberal democracy in the world. This is how this stuff operates, particularly under Tory political parties. It's just happening at an incredibly great rate right now. We really need the media to be applying that lens, even if they feel like that might be a little bit unfair, because we're past that point right now. Like, they've been made to look like idiots again and again for the last 6 months since this government was formed, where they will just present the press release like, oh, they say they're going to do this. The public isn't going to trust you when within a couple of weeks, one, David Seymour just shits on you anyway, and two, completely contradicts himself because he wants to score points. Like, you just apply some base level analysis when it gets released. A lot of the time, you don't even need the full details. You can just say, oh, this is not going to work in the way he says it is. We know this because we've seen this happen 5 years ago. We've seen this happen in the UK. We've seen this happen in the US. New Zealand exceptionalism does not exist. You know, when you underfund public services, they break, and right-wing political parties like to use that opportunity to sell parts of the public service off to private interests, often controlled by people that they're having dinner with tonight. Like, this is just a very well-trodden model at this stage. It's incredibly frustrating to watch the lack of, it feels like the intentional lack of understanding about this stuff, because, yeah, I mean, like I said, we've been saying it since day one. It doesn't need to just be us saying that. It's very frustrating. It could also please be the Labour Party who is saying it sometimes. That would be really good.
And haven't we seen that particularly with this food in schools program? So in my last actual academic role, I was running a project around looking at Aotearoa food cultures, and one of my colleagues was specifically looking at food in schools. And we went to quite a lot of schools and watched these programs. We watched how they were integrated into their community. We watched how they were involving composting, school-based gardens, how they were building into the curriculum to look at health and wellness. We looked at the quality of food they were providing and who they were feeding. And you just saw this like deeply connected for $8 per student. Is that what they, I think, with funding also? Like, for $8 per student, you created a like a network effect throughout the school and the community to create this wonderful kind of like ability to spread not only the word about health related stuff, but also extra food and also how to compost and also how to grow and the connections with the curriculum. And what they're going to do now is sell that to a corporation for, Stephanie, I think you were saying $2 per meal.
It's $3, I think. Is the
$3? Okay.
So it was it was $8, so it was $40 a week. It's now $15 a week. And I think when they say number per meal, people go, oh well, $8 seems, $3 is, but then when you add up and you say, well, $40 a week to $15 a week, like if we trimmed our budgets for lunches that way, people go, oh, that's not a lot, is it?
It was the $2, came from the CEO of Kids Can. And I was really pissed off at how that just got reported as, well, Kids can feed kids for $2. Like, yeah, they're a charity. They get a lot of free labor and a lot of free resources, and things are cheaper when
And you're not including
getting it for
waste
free.
and like logistics in that either. You know, like there's a whole bunch of costs that whenever it's being put forward by a right-wing entity, those costs just, oh, we forget about that. It's just about what's on the balance sheet. No, you're just lying.
What thoroughly irritates me about this too is that extra $5 that is money being spent into a community. So that is the government spending money into a community. When you spend money into a community, that creates wealth in that community. And let's be fair, that is primarily in the lower, people without a lot of money. So you're spending money into the exact place that you need to prevent things like hardship, poverty, the recession that is currently being created in order to affect those kind of things. So instead, you're going to pull that out and you're going to spend $3 into a corporation, and that corporation is going to have a completely different supply chain. And that's not spending money into a community, that's spending money to, wherever they're going to source their things from.
Okay, so did you guys read the Q&A that came with the free lunches announcement that the government put out, where it talked about the reduction in numbers and stuff for secondary school kids and stuff? So there's a few things here which actually leads back to what we were talking about. David Seymour setting up his own shadow government.
Well, I thought that was the Waitangi Tribunal. That was the alternative government.
No, that's
like,
George Soros and the trans people, mate.
Oh, right. It's incredible how like the level of projection, eh? Like he comes out with that the same week as he's saying he's going to set up a secondary like education review office. Incredible.
Fill out your bingo boards now.
So what's going to happen is, well, first let's have a look at why they're changing it. The stats they had were that 91% of lunches that went to schools were eaten. 91%. That is a hit rate higher than a fucking heap of government programs that have not had cuts.
I don't think there's a higher one.
There is also, when they were talking about the amount of waste, which is lunches that were started but not finished, in the government's Q&A explaining why they're doing the policy, they could only provide anecdotal evidence again about 1 3-meter square bin filled in a city area. That was it, just an anecdote. No stats, no facts, nothing.
It was an Auckland City area as well, which I think is important.
Did it say Auckland? Because I just think
it didn't say Auckland. It just said in one area of one particular city, and it's like, okay.
Now I reckon that will be an area where you've got probably 2 or 3 high schools very close to each other. So you're talking about 3,000 plus students. One of those big city high schools, a few of them next to each other. You could probably fill that with waste every day from a school that big because you've got so many students there. But it didn't tally with the actual experience of what you do when you deliver these programs in school, which is, if there was leftover food, you'd give it to your kids who you knew went hungry. You would give them an extra sandwich. You'd say, take this home for your little brother. These kids would walk out of the school with a bag with 3 or 4 burgers in. They would be walking home eating some food. And you would know those kids then had food in their stomach. You would keep some for the next morning. If a kid came in without breakfast and hadn't made breakfast club because they were late, because they slept in, because they haven't been eating properly, you would feed that child right then and there. The idea that there was a massive amount of waste is fucking false, and no one's called them on it at all.
Except us on 1-200.
Except us on 1-200. But then it gets worse, because the new system is the government will use its mass buying power to procure a list of approved foods which schools can then order from. Now, I don't know whether or not they're going to contract directly with providers, or are they literally, is there going to be the government food warehouse somewhere full of muesli bars and things like that? How's that going to work? Schools then have to order from the government off the procured list. And then here's where the transfer of labour has changed, as Andrew was pointing out. Schools are then responsible for ordering, storing, preparing, distributing. All of that now goes into a school. Whereas before, you were contracting it out to a local provider. School I worked at, the first year of this program, got their lunches from a nearby city, but having the lunches prepared and then transported meant all the salads were a little bit iffy. Kids didn't want to eat it. Second year, they went with a provider that was 10 minutes down the road. At lunchtime in winter, pita bread pizzas would turn up warm for these kids. Wedges, warm. This food would be warm in the winter for them, and it would be fresh. The salad would be crunchy. Hell, I've got to admit, I had a couple of them. They were delicious. That company is going to lose its school's contracts, and that's in a small South Island town. a catering company is going to lose a contract for feeding hundreds of people every day. That's job losses. That's people losing their jobs. And those jobs are going to be teaching assistants making sandwiches, because let's just cycle back to that thing about waste. Waitaki Boys High School, just up the road from me, 1,000 kids, preparing 1,000 lunches every day. How much time is that taking from your teaching staff? Oh, the school have to employ someone else? Where's the money for that coming from? Because we're down at we're down at $3 a day now, and most of that's going to be spent on getting the official government warehouse muesli bars. You know, it's very strange that to get this to happen, the libertarian has abandoned the free market in favor of a state intervention and a almost Soviet, but not in the cool way of organizing food distribution. I mean, we're practically at maybe a Polish board game type of thing here.
Yeah, I mean, the
Shout out
capitalists
to
hate
pre-show.
Yeah, the capitalists hate capitalism. I'm trying to think about who talked about this recently. Was it maybe it was Paris Marx or so? There is the capitalists do not want a free market, because then they have to compete, and that's going to create problems for them. They want to be able to accumulate. So that's a totally different question here. What irritates me the most about this is that the flow on. So most people don't think about the economics of these situations. So in order to create wealth in the economy, the government must spend. They have to spend. They create New Zealand dollars. That is the purpose of government. So they do that by spending stuff. Now, they can do that badly. They can spend money badly, and I've got plenty of examples of that. Or they could spend money really well by getting local people to make local food for local schools for those kids who otherwise can't access good food. It's a fantastic system of distribution.
Sorry, I was sticking my hand up because John jumped in when I wanted to talk earlier. So misogynist, John. I just wanted to tie this together because there's I will try not to rant for too long because I don't have my thoughts on this completely organized. But one of the headlines from Seymour's announcement of the food and schools changes was, of course, about his comments about woke food like sushi and quinoa. And I think that was kind of showing us two things. One, he is just absolutely determined to attract the worst possible people in the world to vote for him. He is completely out of touch. I hate doing the whole this person doesn't have kids, they don't understand education or children, because that is a bullshit line. But at the same time, it was very clear who David Seymour was talking to. He was talking to boomers. He was talking to older generations who do not have kids in school, because I have a 3-year-old at kindy, and let me tell you, there's a shitload of quinoa in the lunch boxes parents are preparing. Like, you get little baby food sachets, they all have frickin' quinoa in them. It's hipster madness. But I wanted to tie that back to a broader neoliberal point, which also goes to what Andrew was saying about school gardens and communities and bringing the community together, local providers who are making food for the kids in their local area. There is a fundamental principle underpinning this, which is that neoliberalism doesn't want us to enjoy food. And that goes to a huge number of things like fat phobia and weight loss culture, which I could go on about for many, many hours. But it's about context stripping food into just being a Soylent Green instrumental thing that you take because you need fuel to be a productive cog in the machine. They need us to not enjoy food. They need the food to be bland and simply for the purposes of ticking the nutritional boxes so that we can be productive. They need us to not be coming around the table to enjoy kai together, to have those cultural touchstones of here's what your grandmother cooked, or here's what your neighbors who are migrants have brought from their country to enjoy, or here's shared experiences and delight and joy and community. They need those things to not happen, because as soon as those things start happening, people start asking questions like, but why should a centrally planned government warehouse tell my kid what food they can eat? Why should education just be about an hour of reading, an hour of writing, an hour of maths? Why shouldn't we be able to take time out of paid work in order to do community projects or to commonly own community goods. So it's that one shitty headline from Seymour and this one terrible fucking policy all exposes some of the really just anti-human life and connection, anti-humanity philosophies driving this government. And a lot of them would be real mad to hear me say that, because there's a lot of people, especially in National, who think of themselves as kind and caring and wonderful. Erica Stanford is one. I know she has talked to 2 teachers in my very near family and friends circle who are like, no, she really seems to get it. She really seems to value education and understand what kids need. And now she's gotten into government. They're both like, wait, this isn't what we discussed pre-election, Erica. What's going on? And now she doesn't return their calls. So
if only she was the Minister of Education.
If only she had some power to change something. So I think the self-reflection is a bit painful for some of those supposedly socially liberal members of the National Party. But team, this is what you signed up to. This is what is driving your party's policies, and you're just outsourcing it to David Seymour because you know he will say the things and dog whistle to the tiny minority that you pretend you don't love and cherish.
Essentially what we're talking about here, and a lot of what Steph has just said, is Cory Doctorow talked about the enshittification of the internet and platform decay. Now, this is like, he coined that in 2022, but neoliberalism is basically the enshittification of society, of everyday life. It is providing kids with food that they really don't actually want to eat. It's taking away schools from their communities and setting up new ones which will not have the same deep links. It is cancelling projects and withdrawing funding from things which are needed in the community. It's not funding things that will bring people together, like water networks. It's rates going up. It's the gradual decay of everything that we see around us as more and more capital is attempted to be extracted from a system which cannot bear that. And we are going to be told simultaneously that actually line has gone up. You've got your $20 a week tax cut, and that means you should be better off, while you're watching your kid go, oh, it's the fucking muesli bars again. I don't want to eat that. You know, you cannot contact your child if there's something wrong at school because you can't get in touch with them. You can't like ride a bike safely in your neighborhood. You can't trust that your water system isn't going to fall apart at some point. Shout out to everyone who lives in Wellington, but also everyone else in the country too. You know, you can't trust that your power is going to work in the winter. We are seeing this, and we're being told, "Oh, that's because of the woke agenda. It's because the last government spent too much." And I was just like, "But like things are going to get visibly worse, and we are going to be told that actually they're actually getting better, but not for most people." And there is I know Steph talked about her fantastic comms brain, and I am too struggling with the comms brainworms. And there is a line here which needs to be walked by opposition parties, which is basically, are you going to believe them or are you going to believe your own eyes? It's very close, and I hate to do it, to Ronald Reagan in 1980. Are you better off than you were 3 years ago? You know, is your school better off than it was 3 years ago? Is your community better off? How is your personal finances going? You know, that argument can be made, and they pulled all this money out of the system because they said we spent too much, but your life got worse. Would you like us to do things better? However, that would take a level of political bravery, which is notably absent from any Labour politician who is being allowed to speak to the media at the minute. Because I'm sure there are some out there who would like to, but are not being put in front of the camera, because what they're going to say is, get a fucking load of these guys. Can you believe this shit? Which I think is a message that would go down incredibly well in New Zealand. You know, take a look at this guy. You know, it would work, but they're too busy being sensible. But we have to see all of these things to understand what it is they're actually doing, as if it's not been obvious from the start. Just go and read some New Zealand initiative policy documents. Go and see what the Taxpayers Union's been saying. Go and see what the Atlas Network's been saying. Go and see what these cunts have done all around the world. There isn't going to be a bespoke New Zealand version. You know, you can't slap a Kiwi on it and make neoliberalism look like something that people in New Zealand want to buy into, because over decades, people have gone, oh, that fucking sucked. That sucked too. That sucked as well. Right from Rogernomics onwards, it's like, this has continued to suck for decades. And it's just, what do we get? We get a national government that comes in and drives forward the enshittification. Then we get a Labour government then a Labour government that comes in and says, well, we're not going to make it any worse.
Yeah. And I should say thank you, John. Capitalists Hate Capitalism is an essay from Cory Doctorow. And so Labour MPs, if you're listening to this, just go and read that essay. It's a really good strategy for you. You can say, we like capitalism. This current coalition hates capitalism. And that will probably sing quite well to the kind of my generation, that, the Gen Xers who still have this fantasy that they can create a lot of money, but really hate the fact that their community is being eviscerated by the sucking of all of the goodness out through that process of enshittification.
Yeah, it's this really wild thing that's been the case for a few years now, or at least we've been making the case for it, that there are better right-wing arguments that Labour could be making
Absolutely.
than National is making, and they're making themselves than the arguments they're currently making. And that's absolutely absurd to me. Who is running your fucking comms and the strategy, folks? Like, it feels really easy. We've got one more topic that I want to make sure we get to. And that is still about schools. A few weeks back, David Seymour got his Truancy Register up and running. Time to securitize children's attendance of school based on numbers that were wrong. Andrew, you had a fair bit to say about this. So if you want to kind of give us the entry onto what's happening here.
Yeah, so the daily attendance dashboard, which is now being published by the Ministry of Education, paints a pretty healthy picture about how many kids are actually attending school. And it does have one very useful function for those of us who are quite concerned about one of David Seymour's little pet projects, which is trying to get sick children into classrooms. And I should put a little bit of background here. For those of the parents like us who have very vulnerable children and have watched their kids who have been intensively cared for suffering through viral infections, and that might be because they have immune issues, or it might be because they have disabilities, or it might be just that they were very unlucky, as in otherwise considered to be a healthy child who would now have long COVID, of which is a lot in New Zealand. Scary amount, actually. We really don't want to send our kids into an unsafe environment. We would like to send our kids to school where they don't have an increased chance of getting unwell. Okay, so is that an unreasonable thing to ask, And I think this is really, it does sound quite woke. So, and to be fair, pre-COVID, if I'd said that, people would have said to me, oh, well, unfortunately, children have to suffer through this kind of stuff in order for them to build their immune memory. And it turns out that's just not the case. We don't have immune memory for diphtheria and polio and smallpox, except for, of course, through vaccination, which eradicated these things these scourges from our society. And so the reality for us is that we had this kind of like wonderful period between sort of 2020 and maybe late 21, early 22, where we could actually send our kids to an environment that was probably quite safe, because people were practicing this idea of, well, we're not going to send Johnny to school with a sniffle because that sniffle might be early onset measles, right? Or early onset influenza. We're going to wait and see. And maybe it's hay fever and then he can go to school tomorrow. So we had this, so Seymour presented this idea that sick kids should go to school. There's a level of sickness they talked about, and there was just nothing sensible about that as a policy. What we should be doing instead, if we had a really good, well-funded education system, and the Minister of Education, Erica Stanford, we could actually provide a system where children could switch to what we'd call, say, learning from home. Maybe we practiced this at some point in the past couple of years, and it wouldn't be that hard to create something like an app, where you could access stuff to do if, for instance, you were worried that your child was developing an illness and you did not want to infect the vulnerable kids that sat next to your kid in school. We could also do things like improve ventilation in classrooms, which is cheap and relatively straightforward, and all of those kind of things which would really help. However, what really got me about this daily attendance dashboard is that the data's pretty good. Like I was just looking at, if I just look at it now, the national figures for Tuesday the 7th of May, for instance, 87.1% attendance. And I believe there was this kind of idea that we had vastly worse attendance. And I think the whole thing has just been a huge beat up. And the reality of the situation is there are kids who are not going to school who should be. And the reason they are not is way more complicated than can be solved through sending them to school with a sniffle. It is not that is the problem. And I don't think there is anyone who would argue with that. I mean, please feel free to get in contact with me if you've got a good argument that goes against that. The kids who could be going to school but are not, there are a whole lot of societal issues that underpin that. It is a complex, we might even, as academics, we might call it a wicked problem that is intergenerational and impacted by poverty and impacted by access, about the impacts of education on the parents, what their experiences were of the system, how racism, colonialism, there's a whole lot of stuff that sits underneath that. And if you want to address that, Mr. Seymour, get in touch. I know many hundreds of academics in Aotearoa who have spent their lives researching this kind of work and can give you some really good ideas. But it's not sending sick children to school.
I feel very heartened by your latest comments, Andrew, because this question came up when, I don't know if I've mentioned it on the pod before, but I did run for Parliament in the last election. And the truancy question did come up. It often came up actually in, we had a couple of candidate meetings at rest homes, and people were raising the issue of truancy. And of course, the ACT candidate would get on his tub thumping. We need to have an army of truancy officers who'll pick those kids up and drop them off at the school gate.
War on kids, folks.
More on kids. But what I got a lot of support from a crowd who, let's face it, retired rich white people, was to say, look, sure, we can have that knee-jerk response, even, and just to move away from the sickness thing, because I think a lot of people see Luxon and Seymour talk about truancy and they just assume, because they think other human beings act in good faith, they just go, oh, surely they're not talking about sick kids. Surely they just mean the bad kids who are choosing not to be in school because they're bad. So even moving away from that, you get a lot of sympathy by pointing out, if these kids are so disengaged from school that they're not going, that they don't see any value in going, if their parents were failed by the school system, because we know that the school system has historically failed a lot of different groups in society, what good does it do dropping them off at the gate? So you force them to be there. Does that mean they're going to pay attention? Does that mean they're going to suddenly see value in an education? If they know that at 15 or 16, they're going to have to leave school to get a part-time or full-time job because their parents can't afford the rent, why would they invest any of their time or energy in the schooling system? And people just go, oh yeah, I guess that does make sense. We can't actually nail kids' feet to the classroom floor and make them become academic scholars.
It's actually ACT's policy release next week.
Sure, give them time. It'll be electrical ankle bracelets.
It's without the scholarship part, though. It's just nailing kids to the floor. Yeah.
But what I also wanted to go to, back to the sickness thing, is how this, again, it's the capitalists hate capitalism thing, because it's this kind of short-term thinking that has infected the right, certainly from Key onwards, where it's the immediate profit or the immediate productivity that matters. The long term doesn't matter. It's the short term thinking of, you have to go to work today because we need you to believe that going to work is the most important thing you can do. And who cares if by going to work you infect 4 of your colleagues and then productivity is fucked in your office for the rest of the week because everyone's just passing around the same virus to everyone. Every time I am unwell, and I am the mother of a toddler, so I know where I'm getting it from, I stay home And when I tell people, I've done a rat, it's not COVID, it's just this cough that won't go away, people go, oh yeah, that's going around. I'm like, why the fuck is it going around? Because you'll keep going to work when you're sick, and a lot of you don't have the option of not going to work when you're sick. But that is the philosophy. Again, the driving assumption is that you have to be at work. You have to think that your paid job is the most important thing you can do, and you have to prioritize that even over your own health. And just because we haven't called ACT white supremacists yet on the pod, and I feel that that's another square on the bingo board to tick off, we can't ignore the eugenics element of this, which is the assumption that if you were a healthy, strong person who was eating enough vegetables and going to the gym, you wouldn't get sick. Like, you must be getting sick for a moral reason. Like, it's a moral failing on your part that you keep getting the cold. Never mind the fact that you have a toddler who's in kindergarten who is also bringing all of the bugs home. And you'd go, but they love families, they love kids, they love parents, they love talking about families so much. Yeah, but they don't.
Not like
They
that.
they don't want to incorporate the true economic benefits of having healthy families and healthy kids and parents who can stay home when their kids are sick. They don't want that on the spreadsheet, because it's a lot harder to make the line go up when all you're doing is funneling public money to your donors. She brought it back full circle, guys. She's so good at this.
I do have a little bit on this, because I've been doing a public sector comms degree at the minute, and I've been interviewing teachers about COVID and the changes in COVID policies. And something that came up was that attendance end of 2021 was on the floor and stayed that way through 2022, and only started to recover in 2023. That was when schools started to get most of their kids back. And that's the period where the data the government's using comes from, a period where people were still very scared and keeping their kids at home. And I just went to look at the daily attendance dashboard. So term 1 of this year, how many days do you think school attendance fell below 80% in this country?
Probably all of them, mate.
I'd only be Fridays. It'd be like maybe occasional Fridays.
Below 80%, 3 days.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to know which day? Want to know which days they are? First day of term, the Thursday before Good Friday, and the last day of term.
There you go.
The rest of the time, it was over 80%. Even if only by a whisker, it was over 80% every single time. Because you can click on term 1 and it shows you the whole thing. I don't have all the data from the current term, but it hasn't happened in the first week back. It's ridiculous. Like, it's high. It's up in the 80s, the high 80s. So this thing they're talking about, our schools must aim for 94% attendance, because by 2030, we want to have 80% attendance in schools. Well, if they wanted to, by the end of this year, they could say we've achieved our target. But they won't, because if they did, it would point out what ridiculous target it would be in the first place. They're going to save this for a couple of years and say, since this government came in, there's been 80% tracking. This is going to be Simeon Brown and his stupid power graph.
He's going to have a really stunted y-axis, and the x-axis is going to start somewhere really interesting.
Simeon Brown is a stunted y-axis, let's be honest.
Oh!
Yeah, data science jabs. Let's go.
So I was also going to say that late 21-22 period, not only were people scared, but they were also sick. There was a substantial number of COVID waves and other kind of illnesses that, particularly in the winter in 2022, and also people were still keeping their sick kids home because the previous government had actually said it's a good idea if you stay home when you're sick, But just yesterday, I was fed an ad by Codral, which I thought was a prank. It just said, Codral, soldier on. And they've literally brought it back. It's like, come on. They gave us a couple of years, us with vulnerable kids, they gave us a couple of years where we actually could feel like living without being really scared all the time. And, if if you're a parent out there and you've got able-bodied kids and your kids shake off colds and all that kind of stuff, because I watch them, I get it. I know. I understand. You don't want to have to mess your life around just because your kid has got a persistent cough. I get it. I know it's not a big deal for you, but for us, it's a massive deal. It's a 2-parent job for many days, maybe one in hospital with a child. It's I mean, I had to pin my school-age child down for 20 minutes while they tried to find a vein in his foot to get an IV in because he couldn't take oral medication that your kid throws in the air and catches on their tongue. Like, just think, it's just really important to recognize that these people matter. And my kid is, in the top 1% for abstract reasoning. He could make a huge difference to the world we live in if he's able to survive childhood, Now and there are so many reasons why we need to care for people in the disabled community and treat them as human and as having the same rights that we do as able-bodied people. It's just a basic role of our. I'm ranting. I'm sorry.
No, that's what current
On
events is
one
for.
of 200?
my God.
Rant?
Don't do that
For
here,
shame.
Andrew.
I'm sorry. The problem is I'm a classic Gen Xer. I was raised to just like go, oh yeah. Oh, it's another thing, another reason I'm being fucked. Okay. I mean, we don't actually have to. So my kid's school is brand new and has mechanical ventilation. I'm tracking COVID, right? I can't identify COVID transmission in the school. I can identify it in the community because between siblings, but we can't see kids passing it to each other in classrooms because the CO2 is monitored and we've got mechanical ventilation because it's a brand new school, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's partly why we live here and not in Palmerston North. And the reality is that we could achieve this quite easily, and we can actually backtrack a wee bit and not have a very sick society. And that means you parents you could be good consumers and producers without having to. Yeah.
Well, one of the other things is that during that 21-22 period, some schools just had to close because all the teachers were sick, and we're seeing that happen now as well.
Yeah.
No, nothing changes.
I've got the story up right now. Yeah, Mount Cook School in Wellington had to close for a day because half their staff had COVID, and they managed to get enough relieving teachers to open on the Friday. But really?
Why
So
would
that'll
you?
be where the graph starts. That'll be where Simeon's graph starts. Will be this one day where Mount Cook School was like, please stay home.
See, we had that problem in the South Island at the start of this year, I believe, where the teachers had a teacher-only day and one person turned up with COVID and 30 members of staff then caught it.
It's
And
so easy to solve. It's so easy to fucking solve.
It's so solvable. I mean, like Andrew was saying about 21-22, I remember March, April time of that year. I remember 2 solid weeks where the maximum size of my class was 5 students because we had a rolling COVID wave go through our entire school. We were 1 staff member getting 2 lines on a test away from having to shut. Other schools had to shut throughout that year and have continued to experience significant staffing problems. But don't worry, COVID's over. We don't have to worry about it anymore. Also, there's a school in Wellington called Mount Cook School.
Yeah, it's in Mount
Speaking
Cook.
as a proud South Islander, no, that's Aoraki is ours. You're not allowed to have that.
No, we have our own Mount Cook. It's actually
he just named everything.
very small.
I just earlier this morning I plotted the difference between attendance on the Tuesday the 30th of April and attendance on Tuesday the 7th of May, and the different reasons I looked at to try and see. And I put a polynomial over the graph, and you can see the sort of Wellington and associated region outbreak in the figures. So 2.3% attendance down across that week in Wellington, whereas in Canterbury it's 0.8%. So you can there's a good reason for this dashboard, which is tracking infectious disease spread.
Yeah, not what they intended it for, but we can drag something out of anything.
Yeah, well, we've got good data scientists trying to get, they've got more nuanced data here. We could probably do something really good with this. But of course, I'd be encouraging people to not send their children to school at that point, which might go slightly against Mr. Seymour's issues.
There are much worse things to be against. We might give it a wrap there, folks.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much for joining the podcast today, everybody. John, Stephanie, Andrew, it has been a pleasure to have you as usual.
Cheers.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Right, that's been another episode of 1 of 200. We will be back next week, I think. All going
Unless we all have COVID.
No, oh, wait. I was going to say I soldier on through COVID just to do the podcast, but realistically, if I got COVID again, it would be really bad. Oh, so like, share, subscribe. I hope you enjoyed it, everyone out there listening. Lots going on as usual. We've tried to keep a narrow lens on education policy stuff this week. There's clearly a lot of stuff that we haven't been able to get to. That's the nature of a 1 hour-ish podcast. Hopefully get into a few more things either midweek or in our next episode. We'll catch you next time.
If artifice is art, then I'm living a pointless life, but learning all your lessons. Fucking politics, there's no distinction. The road's upon now. It's paid with good intentions, and I'll admit that I'm at a loss for what to say when they criticize a cost me ought to stay. 'Cause I live amongst the people every day. This vindictive, forgetful fucking race.